Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, this is part 2 of the faux couching stitch. In the first video, I showed 5 techniques for creating a straight stitch to make that faux couching stitch. Now, a couching stitch is nothing more than tacking down something to your work, usually a piece of cording or ribbon, but it can be a found object or something really interesting. The beauty of the couching stitch is you don't stitch through that object, you stitch around it, so it just anchors it in place. To use the faux couching stitch, we're using whatever's printed on the fabric. It can be an imaginary line, it can be a line that you write, or it can be a stripe already printed in the fabric. And the beauty of it is that it plays up that shape and it becomes a really interesting design element. Now, a viewer commented that she uses this couching stitch, or this faux couching stitch, to stitch her lines on a crazy quilt. I think that's a wonderful idea. It's a great way to add placement when you combine fabrics, or you want to stitch over a seam or something of that nature. It adds a little bit of interest, it draws the eye, and it looks intentional, even when sometimes those seams are not. So this is my process for 5 more variations on using the faux couching stitch. So in the first video of this series, the faux couching stitches, and here are just some examples, we did 5 different stitches, variations, using just the straight stitch. So we had our line, our stripe, which we used as our couching cord, and we did different techniques to get a different look, a different effect. We just did little straight stitches evenly across the lines, and then we grouped them, and then we made them unevenly across the lines, and then we made an odd number, so they didn't match. There was nothing symmetrical about it. And then lastly, we made diagonal lines across. And you can make many variations just amongst these as well. Today we're going to do 5 more, but we're going to work on using that line and building off of it. Now, once again, you can use striped fabric, any type of stripe that you want, or you can create lines on your fabric just with a permanent marker. If you don't have striped fabric, there's no reason to buy striped fabric if you don't have it. Stripes come in different ways. They're a little thicker, sometimes they're closer together, and whatnot. So really play around with what you think looks good for the fabric or the line thickness that you're using. And all these stitches can be used somewhat with variations on actual cording, which is the actual couching. Let's get started with our 6th technique. So now for this technique, I'm going to use this line right here. And I'm going to take my thread, and I'm going to use just pink thread. And you can vary the length of this stitch. I'm going to come up from the top here. And again, the line is my guide. And I'm going to make a diagonal stitch right to that line. You can go right through it. You can go right before it. I'm just going to go right through it. And so now you want to make sort of an arrow. So I'm going to go beneath the line, the same distance that I used for my top stitch, same angle is what I'm trying to create, and then I'm just going to come back to that point. So I make, as you can see, sort of an angle. And I'm going to do it the length of the line. You can do it whatever length you want for your piece. And there's just something you want to consider. So if you know you're doing a longer piece, which I'm doing here, and I'll speed this up so you can see it, I'm just going to do all my top angles first. This way I'm using less thread and I'm getting the look that I want fairly easily and efficiently. So again, I just come up from the top, trying to match that angle that I did the first time, and then I come down on that line. So I'm using that line as if it was the cording, and it's a basis point. So then once I have the length of that line that I want to do, I'll just come underneath it, complete my stitches, and finish out that line with this variation. And you sort of see that it looks maybe like birds are flying or arrows leading in one direction. And when I have my piece complete, I'll just knot it on the back. So now for our next technique, I'm going to skip a few lines because again, I'm building off these lines. And I'm going to start here and I'm going to alternate. So I'm going to come up here and create a stitch. And I'm going to go right down just the way we did it in the previous technique. Then I'm going to skip a good distance And whatever distance you want is the right distance. And I'll just finish this top row of these stitches, spaced however I want to space them apart based on my project or just my instinct. Or it can be something as simple as how much thread you have left on your needle. So I have all my angled stitches that go right through that line. Well, now I want to come back on the bottom, coming up through the fabric, and instead of matching where I put my stitch, I'm just going to go in the center here, or just off center. Then I'm going to come back over here to the next one, and again I'm working right to left now, and I make my next stitch. And I continue this, and it's a different effect. There's a lot of space in between stitches, and this gives an area where you can go back in and add more stitches if you want. You can maybe string a pearl or a bead, or you can leave it just as it is. So these are the same stitches, but because we vary them, it has a different look. This is so much more open and airy, and this is a little more directed. So for my next technique, my next row, I'm going to start above the line and pull my stitch down at the same angle. And again, I'm meeting in the center. And then I'm going to make 2 more stitches fairly close together in this little cluster. They're going to be parallel, and they're going to try and match the formation of that first stitch. And since I know I want to fill this line, this space, I'm going to fill this top row with these little clusters of 3, keeping them parallel, but just spacing each cluster a little bit of a ways apart. And so this little spacing, as well as the cluster, is a different design element using that same stitch, that same diagonal straight stitch. So now from here, I want to start underneath, matching those stitches in those clusters and bringing my thread up and then down through that area where I created that stitch above. And all I'm doing is really the same technique we did here, but just in clusters. And you could face them whichever direction you want. Again, this is kind of like an arrow, and it again leads your eye to where you want it to go. And that's just by the nature of the straight stitch, the combination of the angles all being the same, and the way it leads your eye. Sometimes we use this technique by instinct and we don't even realize we're doing it. So now we have this technique of 3 clusters. You could vary it just by using the same methods that we used here, by having the arrows facing the other direction, or by spacing your stitches. Now for our next technique, we're going to build off that line yet again, but instead of making a straight line, we're going to do a sort of a rounded line, and we're going to use the lazy daisy stitch. So I'm going to start here, and again you can face whichever direction you want, but I'm going to start right at that line, and I'm going to lean towards the right. I'm going to make a loop, and I'm going to come right back in very close to the area where I came up from the fabric with my thread. And then depending on the size of the petal that I want to make, I'll bring my needle up through the fabric the distance that I want that petal to be. And then I just pull it to whatever tension I want, and I like that nice rounded hoop that it makes. And then I'll stitch right down. And I'll repeat this procedure the length that I want across here. So again, I come up, make a nice little space here because this is kind of a thick loop. I'll make my loop, come down, and I can just bring my point of my needle up the distance that I want. So there are a couple of little variations to get this technique, and then I just stitch straight down, and that anchors it in place. So I'll do just a couple more. And then I want to go underneath the petals that I created, again, coming out from that line, and just do the inverse, where I make that loop, coming back down through here, and I just anchor it diagonal across here. So it almost makes little hearts, and depending on how you vary your stitches, you can get a heart on an angle look. So you come up from the center, stitch around, right back down, and then bring your needle up where you want to anchor it. And it may take a couple of tries. You could also turn your fabric around if that's easier for you. So this is a very pretty stitch, especially if you want to alternate it. You can transform that into a little heart as well by just making it really deep with your angle. Now for my last variation for this video, I'm going to do a similar stitch to here, but I'm going to vary it. So I'm going to come in on my line where I start my stitch. I'll make my very tiny loop. And I want to hold it down fairly snug to the fabric. I don't want to increase the tension, but I don't want that loop to be very wide. And then I'm just going to stitch it right down just to anchor it and hold it in place. And so now I'm going to skip a distance, come up again on that line, and I'm going to angle my stitch down and at a different angle. So I go around, come back through that loop, and then pull that tight. Or I should say snug. And I'll just pull that snug. And now I'll just continue this the length of the piece. And by varying the stitch size, so it's a little bit smaller, the stitch is less of a hoop, and I'm alternating the angle that these stitches go at, it produces a different look. Again, you can do all your top row stitching first and then finish your bottom row, but for this stitch I don't mind alternating. It's just a preference. So there I have another variation. They almost look like little teardrops. They could be all facing the same way or different ways, and it's a different effect. So I hope you found these 5 variations useful. You might find one that you really like, or you might create your own variation based on something you saw in one of these stitches. And please comment below with how you'd use these ideas in your stitching. Thanks for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.